She's not until.
They just ran us there. That was a labor of love. That was fine.
Yeah, right.
Okay, we're good. Sorry. Yeah. So, talk more about it. Going.
Está bien.
We got.
El capítulo del libro ahora.
No, sí, es claro, no importa que hable bien de mi ley.
You have everything you need? Excellent. Glad to hear it. Okay.
I'm sorry, the camera was.
No, it's okay. Claudia, is it okay if we do the moderating and stuff? You're good? Okay, sure. I just want to make sure that you were good to go. Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everybody on another beautiful day, but at least it's warm and inviting and chocolatey in here. So today we have the pleasure of kicking off our research series with Nathalie Mendez, recently arrived. So thank you for everything you did to get to Bloomington.
Patient.
I know it's been a long process, but we're thrilled to have you. Today, Nathalie, who's working with Claudia, great to see you as well, Claudia, is going to be presenting on gender attitudes among public employees, comparative analysis. And Nathalie, of course, is as well an associate professor, at the School of Government at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, with a PhD in political science at Texas A&M. So again, we're just thrilled, Nathalie. Can't wait to hear everything you have to say. And per usual, we'll keep account of our discussion to follow your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a recent transition from assistant professor to associate professor, actually.
Congratulations, there's good. That's no small feat.
I applied, I was assistant and now I'm associate. So yeah, that was months ago. So it's really exciting news. So thank you very much for having me. As you said, I'm Nathalie Mendez. I work at the School of Government at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And this project is with Claudia Avellaneda, who is also here from O'Neill School. I just want to start just describing how excited I am to be here. So first of all, I could not be more excited. Just the fact to be here, in this house at what represents is such an honor. So I just want to say that because this opportunity is great. So I look forward to seeing you during these 3 weeks I'm going to be here. And that's why I introduced my research areas. I work on public management, public leadership, collaborative governance, more broadly Latin American politics with Claudia, also in a book in progress. And in general, I'm interested in answering this question, and is how attitudes and behaviors, mainly of public employees, shape policy outcomes. So how those perceptions about, life and religion and gender, as we are going to talk about that today, shape policy outcomes, and how these dynamics of trust, collaboration, and leadership can also change public and private intervention. So that's my research question. So if you want to chat, I'm going to be around during these weeks, and I hope we can have time to talk about this a little bit. So related to this project about gender attitudes among public employees, the first motivation we have is related to this literature of public service motivation that is very important in public administration. And what it says is that in general, public employees are more committed to public interest in general. So they prefer to commit to public's best interest, and this assumption has been tested across countries and during several decades. For instance, other studies in this same public service motivation literature have shown that public employees are also more altruistic. They're more willing to have this public interest, generally speaking, in practice and in an abstract way. In a recent paper that we published with Claudia in Public Administration, we also said that, and we also tested the hypothesis that public employees participate more in civic organizations and associations, especially those that are public across countries. So yeah, we find these differences between public employees and private employees. Another thing that we want to say is that in general, public employees, that's what the literature says, are more committed to social service. So they're more service-oriented people instead of private or just individual interest people. However, we find that there's not so much work about how bureaucrats' attitudes are connected to specific public values. And specifically, we are going to talk about democratic consolidation, and we're going to discuss a little bit more about that. But in this article, we want to show that bureaucrats' attitudes on gender equality are important, but also that public employees are more committed to this gender equality attitude, which is actually a way to show some sort of like positive way of democratic consolidation. So this is the research question. Actually, there are two, because we have an explanation based on individual, like an individual dimension, and another one of more context dimension. So the first research question is, do bureaucrats tend to favor more egalitarian gender attitudes than other citizens? We just want in that first step, test that assumption that public employees have attitudes that might be different from the rest of the citizens. And then how and does the context matter? And we are going to describe a little bit more about that theory in a minute. So talking about the drivers of gender inequality, I know some of you have worked about gender gaps and how to analyze gender inequality across disciplines. So we really want to jump in the discussion about that. But in general, there are several factors that seem to contribute to the gender gap. Some of them are related to economic and institutional opportunities, right? Like more structural factors. But some of those factors are also related to cultural issues. For instance, patriarchal attitudes, these stereotypes that citizens have about the role of women in politics or in business, and even in some authors have found these differences and this gap in terms of language and how people describe women. Another line of research has centered on the link between democracy and gender equality, and that's also part of the motivation to start working on this project. We know public sector is very important for reduce that gap in terms of gender equality. It can happen through different ways. For instance, public sector offers employment opportunities to women. So if public sector, for instance, quotas or any other policy measure is designed, we know that that can increase the chance of women to get better jobs and get better payment, right? But we are going to focus more on attitudes. That's like the main category here. And it's because attitudes matter, not only because we say that in the paper, but also because attitudes are, that also is also described in the literature, are disposition to behavior, right? We don't say that, we don't imply here that if you have an attitude toward an issue that you're going to behave in a certain 100% way, but you will be more likely to treat people in the way that you believe those people are, right? So we argue that public employees' attitudes can favor women equality, and that can be actually good in a material and symbolic way. So if public employees, for instance, have these attitudes that don't value equality the way democracy wants, well, they might treat women in a negative way, or the public goods might be delivered maybe with some characteristic that we don't decide. Another thing that we, and another line of literature that we want to say in this part of the theory is that gender equality predicts democracy. At least that's what Christian Belzel, Ronald Ingersoll have described in Theory of Modernization and all the work of World Value Survey. And they said that empowerment and emancipation of women can actually be very important in the process of modernization and democratization. And that's why also attitudes about gender equality matter for democracy. So we are using as I said, we are using like an individual level explanation and a more context related explanation. The individual one is related to this public value concept that is a central concept in public management. And I'm just describing it a little bit because I know we have a interdisciplinary audience, which is great. So public value, the original concept described by Moore, says that people, society in general has like collective aspirations, and that's public value, aspirations of fairness, of transparency, of equality. So public value represents those collective aspirations. And equality is important because that's something that is desirable and is actually matching with democracy values too. So considering that gender equality is a critical dimension of democratic consolidation, we will expect that public employees defend public value and also show attitudes that endorse gender equality, because we are assuming here that employees are more committed to, public employees are more committed to public value. So that's the first hypothesis. Public employees tend to report more positive perceptions of gender equality than non-public employees. So that's the first difference. And the second level explanation is about the context. So it doesn't only, we don't only care about individual attitudes, but we also care about the context where the attitudes are formed, right? So it's different, a public employee that lives in a country in South America, that public employee that lives in Europe or in Southeast Asia, right? So based on that the context matters, we are saying that the context in which public employees operate can moderate those positive attitudes towards gender equality, right? Because there are laws and culture and social and economic opportunities that can moderate that effect that of public employees being more favorable to gender equality. We said, and of course, we all know that these structural opportunities that shape the context, we can see those features in different parts of the world. For instance, and especially in developing countries, we know that women tend to be underrepresented in labor market and overrepresented in unpaid care work. So context matters. So that's just stressing, emphasizing the point. So the second hypothesis is that public employees' perception of gender equality are moderated by the context, right? Where and the context where those employees, public employees, live and work. Just turning perfect. Just going to the data and methods and how we test this hypothesis. We use individual level data from the 7th wave of the World Value Survey. That was the last wave of the survey before the pandemic. Now, I'm actually a principal investigator of the World Value Survey for Colombia. We are planning the 8th wave. That will be this year until 26. So that was the last wave that was applied in 77 countries before the pandemic. It has about 60,000 observations across the world, and that's what we are going to show in a few minutes. And just for those who are not familiar with the World Value Survey, it's consistent with this assumption of the theory of modernization by Ronald Ingersoll and Christian Belzel that says that countries that are more like modern should go this way, like to this upside part of the graph. And when, for instance, we are talking about gender equality attitudes, so countries that favor equality of women should be in this side, like Europe, of course, English-speaking countries, and even like countries in Latin America that are moving to a more liberal values, such as Uruguay. So this is what these attitudes and these values theory is saying. So we are using that data, and we are also using country level data from the Gender Inequality Index, that is the measure of the context. So just to give you a sense, a little bit of what is the Gender Inequality Index, that's calculated using 3 dimensions: health, maternity, mortality ratio, adolescent birth rate, another dimension of empowerment that shows and that is including information about secondary education and political representation, so the proportion of women in parliamentary seats, and the labor market. that is the participation of women in the labor. So that's aggregated in this gender inequality index. We use the 2019 data, which is the one that we want. It was available, and that matches a little bit with the 7-way. In terms of the dependent variable, we are using this measure of democratic perception related to gender attitude. Citizens were asked to respond this question in a scale to from 1 to 10, where 1 is I disagree completely, and 10 is I agree completely. How do you agree with this sentence? And it's women have the same right as men is an essential characteristic of democracy. So do you disagree or? So we use that. We use another dependent variable as a robustness check. We control for sex, education, age, size of town, ideology, perceptions about abortion as a measure of liberal attitudes and might be influencing the result. And also region, because as we just saw in the map of cultures, well, Latin American countries are different from Middle East countries, etc. In terms of a modeling strategy, we can talk a little bit if you want about that in the discussion. We use ordinary least squares regression models and a logistic regression models for the robustness check. And just to give you a sense of the gender inequality index, the red parts, the darker red, is showing higher levels of gender inequality. So as you can see, like Africa, some countries in Latin America, this part of Asia, have higher levels of inequality in terms of like gender inequality. Countries in Europe, the US, and some countries also in Latin America are better in terms of less average in terms of gender inequality. So in terms of the result, perfect. So for the first dependent variable, that is, do you agree that women equality is an essential component of democracy? Well, we can see here in terms of public employee and this significant and positive value is that being a public servant has a positive effect on the perception that women equality is a characteristic of democracy. So public employees seem to have these positive perceptions about women equality, which is consistent with the hypothesis. Then we can see the gender inequality index that is negative coefficient and is significant. And that shows that a citizen that lives in a country with higher level of inequality, gender inequality index, of course, is less likely to think that women equality is a part of the democracy, right? So it's also consistent with the common sense there. I just want to describe this interaction, what happens with a public employee and gender inequality index. And what we can see here is that the sign just flips from positive to negative, which means that being a public employee in a country with high level of this inequality just change the sign, right? Change that effect. The positive effect of being a public employee is moderated by the context. So it changed to negative. And people, yeah, we think that that shows the strong effect of the context where those public employees live. As I said, we run also like a robustness check with another dimension of attitudes towards gender, not related to democracy, but in general, a sentence that said men should have more right to a job than women. Not doesn't say anything about democracy, but say it tells a lot about how people perceive women, right? So here, it was run as logistic regression model because it's only agree or disagree. So that's why the modeling specification here is logistic regression model. So here, consistent to the previous set of models, public employees disagree with the idea that men should have more right to a job than a woman. It's negative, but it's significant. So that's consistent with the previous model. When we include gender inequality index, again, that effect goes a little bit insignificant here. And when we run the regression with the interaction, the effect disappears. So that positive effect of being a public employee on gender equality disappears when we interact. That is here. public employee and gender inequality index. So it's a lot of digesting, but we just want to say that there's something going on that we think it is very interesting. And just to jump to the discussion, the analysis of public employees' attitudes matter. As we said, attitudes are important and are important probably predictors of how we behave. We have this intuition, but also the literature has says that we know public employees deliver goods and public employees treat women in different contexts. So if they have gender equality attitudes, they might be more likely to treat them fairly and to treat them in a positive way and to reduce that gap, even in a symbolic way. In general, what we can see, and this is a work in progress, and we appreciate all your comments, public employees tend to have attitudes that favor gender equality, but that effect is contingent on the context, right? And the gender inequality context where they operate and live. We acknowledge some potential limitations of data. Of course, data on perceptions have always some difficulties. We know, for instance, that the Gender Inequality Index only measures parliamentary representation, which is just a little piece of information of representation of women, but we're trying to include maybe another measure of, I don't know, executive representation in government in a more broadly way. Yeah, we are dealing with that. But we think that public employees have this stronger sense, not only of public value in general, but they have also attitudes that favor democratic values. And we want to start this discussion in the paper. So we think it's a contribution for that intersection between public administration and public opinion literature. And as we know, public employees are very important for promoting policies, delivering services. So we think this research matters, and we have found this opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you so much for your time and consideration. I think we look forward to receiving your comments. Thank you.
What a tour de force. Thank you, Nat.
Thank you.
Terrific. So yes, the queue is open. We'll give students kind of the first dibs if we're not to put anybody on too much on the spot, sorry. Yeah, Louis, let's start off with you. And then, we'll keep the queue. Yeah.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions on the data you're using just to see if I'm understanding the story correctly. So first, and sorry if I missed part of this explanation before, but if I understood well the sample, like this survey goes and asks these questions to citizens that as a subset of these citizens could or could not be public employees, right? So basically like the analysis is capturing differences in the perceptions of like these role that women have in a democracy between public employees and other citizens. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to ask. First, it's like whether do you think the results are capturing like a normative stance on the respondents of the survey rather than a positive one? Like, and it got me thinking on the way the question is phrased, because it's like women have the same right as men. It's an essential characteristic of democracy. So like I was thinking like whether respondents could think, oh, I do agree with that, but I do not necessarily observe that in my specific context, and whether your like the sample is capturing that, whether this is more like an are the results framed more as an ideological characterization or more as like your perception of how do you like your political system operates? And the other one, and this is more like on just like thinking of how the model is specified, is whether you thought of maybe running like the same model but like in separate subsamples, just like comparing the coefficients on your explanatory on your independent variables between the ones that are the subset of the sample that are public employees and the ones that are not. Because like if I am getting the results correctly, you are capturing like the variation between the respondents that said that there are public employees and the ones that are don't, conditional on several variables. but I'm not sure whether that says like they have differences in their perceptions. They're just saying like conditional on your covariates, whether the difference in the perception is significant. But maybe to shed some light whether like some regions could perceive this as a more relevant thing or not. Like running the same analysis but just like separating the sample. Because the thing that got me thinking of this is like how many, and maybe this is just like a descriptive statistics question, like how many people are public employees in the sample? Like are we comparing like 5% of the population against like the rest of the citizens, or I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, makes sense. Should I respond to?
Please, feel free. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Well done, Luke.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yes, you're interpreting the results like in the right way, and I'm glad that it's clear. So yes, there's a question in the survey that says where do you work at? So it says public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. Those are the three options. So we create a dummy variable and we said those people work in the public sector, and that's what we are using in the models. I'm going to start with the second question. So that's a very good idea. We just have run like the models with all the sample. And in terms of proportion, there are countries that have, and these are like representative samples in each country. That's the condition of the world value survey. So it's kind of a good sample for each country. So we have not run these like separate samples, and that's a good idea. We are going to do that. I think it's a good idea to show like the comparison between the different models. But it's broadly speaking about like 15% of people of our sample are public employees. So it's a good size. Some countries like in Colombia, it's 10%. Some other countries like in Uruguay is like 30% of the sample who are public employees. So I think it's a good number. And because we have thousands, so yeah, it's a good sign. In terms of the first question and the differences between public versus other, yes, the main dependent variable is very normative, right? Like it should be a characteristic, right? It's a characteristic of democracy, and democracy, as we know, has different interpretations. And we were talking about this with Claudia yesterday. Like they are people in the sample that are from, for instance, Middle East, right? So they are asking about democracy. So I don't know. This has like different implications, but yeah, we really I think it's normative. With the second dependent variable, that is men should have more right to a job than a woman, I think we are looking into a more maybe like daily life measure, right? Like, okay, yeah, I might think that is good, but in terms of jobs, maybe not. And we have another, I think that's something we can do, maybe running the models with other attitudes about women equality. For instance, there's like men do a better job as political leaders than women, or men are better at a business as business executive than women. So that's more like that empirical or practical side of the woman and the gender equality. So that's a good recommendation to compare that normative versus other dimension. Thank you.
Wonderful. And maybe Diana, we'll turn to you next. And then I think Gustavo, you're actually.
Thank you, Nathalie and Claudia, for presenting your work. It is great for us to learn, about what you're doing, and I really appreciate it. I have some comments and questions, but don't feel like you have to answer all of them. Maybe they are for another papers and not this one. I think, well, the first is that I think that this is a very important research in a world where we're seeing that gender roles, stereotypes are being weaponized as a source of political power. So they translate into votes. If you legitimize violence against women, that translates into votes. If you speak against their rights, that translates into votes. So I think this is really key to understand. I had the question about the particular conjuncture, because after the COVID pandemic, what we saw is that the gender gap increased, and that it will take, well, estimates vary, but 150 years to go back to acquire gender equality according to UN, some of the UN statistics, and we can discuss about how those numbers are created. But I think that the COVID conjuncture is a very important one in your research because it deepened these inequalities in ways that are not going back very quickly. Most of the jobs that were lost were women's jobs and they're not being created again. So one of those things are very important. I was thinking about also the implications of these in Colombia, where we have, for the first time in history, a government that is openly thinking about equality. Now we have a Ministry of Equality, and the gender gap has been a key question for many institutions in ways in which we've never had. We have parity in many executive positions that we never had in history. So it also seems like it is a different moment in that sense, in the formal sense. Then we can talk about, how pervasive this masculinist domination is, among public servants, and we can go to specific cases all we want. It also seems a pretty important historical moment in Colombia because of also of the wins of the abortion movement. Like finally, after many, many decades of a struggle, we got it. Isn't it? Like we got it on paper, not on the streets. And I think that the normative and positive thing is also a very important question there. So one was about that, about, the specific conjuncture and how 2023 is really 2024, sorry, we changed years, is different from 2019, from the map that you showed us that is based on 2019 data. I was thinking about, yes, how the nation state scale can be tricky. This would be very different if you think about urban and rural areas in those different countries. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking about something that you already mentioned, and is the public-private divide. In Latin America, we have a saying that at home you are, on the streets you are El Che, at home you are Pinochet. It's like you are a dictator when you get to the home, but on the streets you're very open, and en la casa, en la calle El Che y en la casa Pinochet. We say that all of the time. So I think that a lot of, of where I'm coming from, feminist geography, and a lot of feminist geographic work is precisely troubling that distinction between private attitudes and public attitudes, private behaviors and public behaviors, because they're very much connected, which made me think about the work of Joni Seeger. Joni Seeger is a geographer. She's probably 85 now, so most of her work happened, many decades ago. But she was the one overlapping different maps of the world. So abortion maps with parity, in executive power maps of cosmetic surgeries and life expectancy at birth and things like that, that really tell you, of the geographical distribution of these. So I was thinking about how cool it would be to, to add more layers of complication to that. And one very quick comment that is probably just a footnote in some of these publications is that some of your variables were sex. And I think that is very tricky, because if you include, I'm assuming that you're talking about cis men and cis women. If you include trans women into this study, we will cry, because there the gap is so much more heartbreaking. Thinking also with Joni Seeger's map. Joni Seeger has a map of feminicide and how you can map feminicide with gender parity in Congress, and how those maps really show, how important these issues are. So again, comments for future ideas, future papers, but I think it was really, thank you. I appreciate it. It was really interesting hearing about your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. So yes, about the COVID conjecture, I mean, it was just coincidence. The fact that this 7-way was applied between 17 and the first months of 2020. So it's almost the entire sample was conducted before the pandemic. The next wave, which is the 8th, is going to be conducted from this year to 26. But good news, and I think we might find some potential collaboration in that topic, is that we have a project that is a sub-project of the World Values Survey that was called Values in a Crisis. And everyone is, if we want to talk about that, I'm very open to talk about that. We measure values during the pandemic. So we did a panel, and the same people responded the questions in 2020, 21, and 22. During the pandemic, when the social life restart a little bit, and once the economy recover a little bit. So we have that data for Colombia, for Austria, for other countries, but we have that panel, and it's great because you can see if people get more, and we saw that people start, that during the pandemic, trust in government increase in a way that we haven't seen, like in terms of attitude, and then it start to decrease. So people fail because of fear, government, yes, you do whatever you have to do, and the trust increase, and that was very cool. We haven't analyzed what happened with gender attitudes. So we have that panel that it's brand new. If anyone wants to jump on the data, we can talk about that. So we can find if the pandemic have an impact, and I'm assuming it had. Yes, your rural areas more conservative, so less prone to have the gender equality attitudes. We have to explore that a little bit more. That private versus public behaviors, that what happens at home, and that reminds me, and that's connected to your point, your name? Luis, to Luis' point, and it's like, we have other like measures of gender attitudes. For instance, women should be at home, and the main role of women is to take care of children. We have a variable like that. So actually, this is getting, maybe is giving us ideas of see variation in different, women attitudes. And that's different. Maybe I perceive that women can do a good job at politics, but maybe I just think that they should be at home or something like that. Maybe that variation is interesting to capture. And yes, I agree with the tricky of the sex variable, just women, men. This project, the World Value Survey, started in 1982. So in 1982 was a different war, and there's always a tension about like modify the questions or just keep it comparable through all the weights. That's why we still measure men, women, but that discussion about how we measure transgender, other issues, LGBTQ, we talked about that yesterday, that's a discussion now. So they are thinking about including like a specific set of questions related to that, but yeah, unfortunately, that's the measure we have, and probably we don't make that visible, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So I think right now we have Mikhail, and then Chen, and Gustavo, and then I probably missed others. So Charlie. Okay, so Mikhail.
To be faster.
Oh yeah, these are great.
Nathalie, thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed listening to it. You did a great analysis. And I have one specific question about the results you obtained. Sometimes when you ask people about their attitudes, you can encounter the problem of social desirability bias. It means that people can respond in an affirmative way, not because they, truly believe that these things should be obeyed, but because of the fact that they feel pressure from the society and from the, the institutions to say this way. And my question is, do you consider that social desirability bias could be an issue for your research, or you somehow mitigated it?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for bringing that point to the discussion, because, and that's connected to this also, like this dimension of normative, what is desirable, especially because these are like face-to-face. That's the problem sometimes with perceptions and surveys. This is face-to-face interviews, at least because it was before the pandemic. So you have a real interviewer asking you, do you think that women, yeah, probably that's an issue with perception survey. We want to mitigate that risk by including these other dependent variables. So not only do you think is desirable, but also what do you say about women in your home, at your home, or at politics or at business? So maybe I think we need to include those different effects to capture and try to say, yes, it's consistent that these citizens have this attitude. So women, regardless the context of the question, or maybe they're different. And maybe there's another finding about that. Like people maybe say that in public, they're very progressive and liberal, but maybe at home, they're more conservative and less tolerant to, I don't know, less open to gender equality. But yeah, that's a good question. And we really need to include that in the potential limitations because we need to acknowledge that that's the limitation of the data. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen, I think you're up next.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathalie, for this very interesting research. And I think it's especially interesting that you think you would like to examine the moderation effect from the Gender Equality Index. And I think that's a formal institution that you want to examine the moderation effect. But I'm wondering that, so although from your findings, this is not a significant moderation effect, but I'm wondering that, do you have any interpretation of this moderating effect? And I have another comment that, have you ever thought of, instead of using this formal institution index, have you ever thought of, for example, include some informal institutions like culture, for example, have a Hofstede culture index, because people's perception of some concept could be, I think, could be more influenced by the informal institutions instead of some formal institutions. I thought that might be a way that you would like to try. And one more question is, you mentioned that you also include the dummy variables of as an employee in the nonprofit sector, and because I'm a nonprofit scholar, and I'm really interested to see, do you have any interesting finding on that? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good points also. Yeah, the reason, of course, we really didn't want to include like endogeneity, just including questions about cultural context based on the same survey, which is the World Value Survey. So that's why we include like this, as you said, formal institutions, but also like empirical data on how women are doing around the world. And that's why we include gender inequality index. I think this cultural index, maybe other data sets can provide that, that control as well. So we are going to explore that. Thank you so much, Chen, for bringing up that point. And yes, related to the second question, yes, we only wanted to measure public versus the rest. But we are also thinking about running public versus private, private versus nonprofit, public versus nonprofit, because of course we are not saying in the paper that private and nonprofit are the same. Actually, they're very different. There are very different incentives for people that work in nonprofit versus private. So yeah, so we need to digest that a little bit more. And as soon as we have the results, I will let you know, because it's not over that analysis, but I think it's worth it to also have these subcategories compare. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to your further findings.
Thank you. Thank you, Chen.
Yeah, I think Gustavo. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I have 3 comments. So one about data, one about empirical methods, and the last one about interpretation. So regarding data, I would have some doubts about including democracy in this question. So just 2 examples. China is autocratic, relatively egalitarian in terms of the relationship between sexes. India is democratic, and it's the opposite. And with that, we took 35 or 40% of the world population. So I think you have to be careful, especially with countries that had a history of communism. Communism, like they are without all autocratic regimes, but they were to be much egalitarian in terms of the sexes, okay, in terms of how people manage the gender issue. So in terms of statistical methods, I think it's very difficult to consider that you are picking a causal relationship here. Okay, so it's just a pure correlation. It can go in the other direction. So it could even be the case that essentially because of some attitudes that you have, you are more likely to be higher in the public sector. you're maybe picking up something else. So people are not randomly choose to be public servants. So it may be their education, their career path, their IQ, whatever. They have very, very different reasons. So I think it's very difficult to interpret your empirical findings because cannot be interpreted as a causal effect. And finally, even if I believe the effect as a causal one, I think there are many other alternative explanations and hypotheses compared to the ones that you put at the beginning, okay? These kind of public servants are going to, they are more engaged with this thing that they believe is good for society. The simplest possible explanation would be that they don't pay for any of the costs because taxpayers pay, but you're in the private sector. In order to encourage gender equality, you pay for part of the cost. So essentially, that's the reason public employees. So we all tend to be very moral when you don't pay when you cannot use the money on yourself and you don't pay the cost. Because what else are you going to do? So you tend to go for moral reason, for moral or social goals, okay? So that could be a simple public choice explanation of why public employees, and it's nothing good. It's simple that they are not paying the price tag of these policies.
Thank you. Yeah, very good points also. The first one that is related to data, yes. Of course, there's a lot of variation between the countries. We are thinking that it's also good to, we're actually working on maybe running the models not with like region fixed effects, which is like some sort of explanation of our value survey, that there are like similarities between regions, Latin America, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, etc. But to include country fixed effects to show, for instance, this, as you said, China versus India, that has some things that are common, but all others that are not. In terms of like the sample, these are like national representative samples, and in some point it does, if I'm not wrong, China has in the survey like 3,000 number of participants like included because of the representativity of the sample, and Colombia has like 1,500. So it's not it's not proportional to the number of population, but the representative goes to a sample that is not too far. So I think we are controlling for that, but in terms of country, I think country fixed effects might be a good way to say what is going on and trying to capture it. So good recommendation. Yes, we need to emphasize the correlation versus causal, and that's very important in the paper, and we need to be more clear and explicit about that. And in terms of the last one, the interpretation, that's actually very good. Of course, we always build on this like public service motivation and public management and, very normative, very moral, but also it has that assumption that public employees tend to perform, consistent with public value. That has been tested around the world, but the public choice literature maybe can explain also these different incentives. And if we think about how people, I was public employee for 10 years. I worked with the Colombian government for 10 years, and I always tell Claudia that I really like the public sector, regardless of salary and regardless everything. So there are different types of public employees. So yes, I'm just thinking about how incentives are structured just by chance. The only opportunity in a country might be public sector, but also maybe something about the motivation. So it's an interesting discussion, and I think it gives us ideas to think more a little bit about that. Thank you.
And Charlie, and then Claudia, if that's okay.
So one, wonderful work. I thought your presentation was just awesome. I really could just completely follow it. So
You know why? Because she's from Colombia. But the way it's cut, I'm very happy that today Latin Americans are overrepresented in this.
Pulling our apart.
And even Colombians are also overrepresented today. Diana, Nathalie, it is covered. I
Very nice, very nice. Well, I just wanted to give you, I think in some of your answers, you already conveyed some of the directions you're going ahead, but like, where do you see the next couple of years? What are you gonna do? And then especially in the other dimensions of inequality. I was wondering if you're thinking about taking these same methods and working in other dimensions.
Yes. So future projects and yeah, with Claudia, we have discussed a lot about this, like how important is to understand how public employees think, because it's not the same if someone, and it's the front desk, right? Like they're treating citizens daily. And those attitudes are very important. We want to move towards other dimensions of diversity. So for instance, there are questions about LGBTQI+. That's awesome because they asked about homosexuals in the 80s, and we haven't found papers about that. And they ask about this. Yeah, so there's also about migration. And yeah, we want to go into different subcategories because, of course, yeah, the data is not perfect, and we know that that can happen. But the fact that this has been asked for so many decades give us a little, yeah, I think a big opportunity to go deep into different groups. And I think that's one main step, that is like what happened yeah, with other groups. In terms of my yeah, not only with collaboration with Claudia, but also my agenda in Universidad de los Andes, I'm also very interested in public leadership. I just published a paper in the International Journal of Public Administration saying that mainly argue that top level managers can introduce some collaborative strategies. That's based on another data. But what is interesting is that leadership can be very powerful, changing this environment. So we said today that context matters, but also what I want to test and I want to analyze in the future is what leadership can do, right? Like, what if we have a woman that is in a leadership position? Because we also have, for instance, a question about where are you at the ranking, like top manager or middle size? Yeah. So what can leadership do to transform? And that's also like a contribution to public management and other. So I think that like other groups and also leadership strategies to moderate this effect or try to, you know, I don't know, mitigate the effect of context. Maybe it's just too overwhelmed for public employees to live in countries where gender is not doing well, gender equality, but maybe there are leaders that saying, wait, I can do something about it, and maybe introduce strategies in my organization, regardless of public or private, or maybe they're just good leaders at those contexts.
2 fingers?
It was on this management question, I guess. I'll try to make it really short, which I find interesting because I would expect, or I'd be interested to know whether you think that leaders in like higher ups, maybe even political appointees, I don't know if that's actually in your might feel like they have more capacity to answer aspirationally about the role of gender than their sort of more foot soldier, you might say, bureaucrats, right? In terms of they might view the role of culture and its effect very differently. And I'd be just curious to see if that interaction effect changes at different levels based on the perceived control that they have as a leader that you were going to talk about. So I think that'd be super interesting.
Yeah,
to hear about.
that's super interesting. I think that interaction will be great to explore. Also because leaders tend to overestimate their own skills,
Exactly.
but also the skills of the employees, because they don't want to, you know, be perceived as less effective or, so yeah, it will be good to contrast and test whether they have more aspirational, you know, preferences. And yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
All right, Claudia, you get the last question, and Natalie, you get the last word.
Someone else to ask has a question. I never mind my question.
Something very short, super short.
I know.
I'm sorry that I'm speaking again.
Oh, it's fine.
But I think that one interesting interdisciplinary dialogue would be with all of this institutional ethnography and this whole subfield of ethnography of bureaucrats. So a lot of, the very qualitative everyday analysis of how bureaucrats operate. Lina Uccelli has written about this in Colombia. There's work from Maria Victoria Castro. So there are many examples that I can come up with if you're interested into that, but I think it would complement so much the view because it is, going within an institution and getting into these ideas like little by little. Lina's is about Madres Comunitarias and how public policy was, the architecture of public policy within, specific programs. So I think that would be super interesting just to,
Yeah, and actually in my doctoral dissertation, I use mixed methods, and of course this I explore collaborative governance in public employees in Cartagena. So I conduct like in-depth interviews and also ethnography, and it's very interesting because they say, yeah, collaboration is important, but when you ask them like, okay, how do you do your work? They collaborate in an informal way all the time. I just call someone that I know in the other secretary or ministry, and that actually works for them. They don't need the connect. I mean, they don't need, have like a high level of authority. They just need to have the connections. So that shows a lot about social networks. So I think, yeah, I think ethnography and I think mixed methods approach can be another like future stage of these projects related to attitudes, like how that translates into behaviors. Like actually, yeah, how people treat women in your office and how that's changing or not, right? So yeah, great idea also.
Any final thoughts or comments you might have before we have to? Oh, please.
So, no, I was thinking about these issues of the causal relationship between the variables at hand. And the biggest problem is that you cannot assign occupation randomly across your individuals, no? But I was thinking if there are some possibilities of doing that with the data that you have at least, or replicating that setting, no? And I was thinking that maybe there are some countries that expanded their public sector quite impressively in one of these regions and so on. And if you can capture that those exogenous events, like I don't know, for some reason they discover oil and they expanded the public sector because of that, that might be read not very cleanly, but at least up to some extent that can be read as a shock propelling altogether a lot of people into the public sector that before couldn't work there, or it's the only thing that they have after the shock, things like that, no? And that would start like
That's
solving the problem.
That's very interesting. Actually, like I just have in my mind some cases, but literature has said that in countries with liberal governments, more prone to center to left, state size tend to increase because they argue that the state should be more responsible of doing things than the private sector. So I'm thinking about the case of Uruguay, for instance, where during Frente Amplio administration, the state increased a lot. That's correlated also with left-right ideology and other things. But I'm guessing we need to think about that, like maybe instrumental variables, or I don't know, something exogenous that is saying something about public sector size.
So I think the best you can do is to take those exams to enter into a public administration. But then you need to track people that took the exam and were accepted, and people that were rejected, but they got score that were very similar. I don't think you'll have those people in the data because you have data of the surveys. And that will give you something like that. So.
And
What about if in that case, sorry, Luis, if in that case, instead of seeing increase of the sector, let's say that the government decided to privatize agencies. So many people lost jobs in the public sector because now it was contracting out, went to the private sector. In that case, we should see decrease or support for that.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that could also be. I mean, the problem is that you will always have selection, no? You will
Yes.
always have these people selecting themselves in the public sector or not, no?
Yeah.
But at least if you have some variation in the opportunities within the public sector, and your results still hold in the presence of those variations that can strengthen a little bit the causal reading of the whole thing, no?
But you need to
Um,
sample those. It doesn't matter the whole universe of public
Yeah,
employees
you
or
have
the
to
whole
interview
universe of
those.
private sector. You have to sample those guys, no?
Yeah, I mean, if it is a super large shock, then for
Maybe.
sure, a huge part of the sample will be affected by it, and then I mean,
Quickly.
you can strengthen your story.
Maybe an easy way to get at that would be, and just as a random thought, considering like the data you already have, just to look at which countries had an election during the survey was like collected. Because arguably when there is a change in government, there will be a change in some of the public employees. So there maybe that could operate as some sort of random shock into employment. That might not necessarily change the composition on gender or like necessarily across like the levels of the employees, but that might be some sort of a way of capturing that cross-sectional variation within that sort of.
And within your sample, I
I'm
would.
just mindful of the time.
Sorry.
Sorry, guys, because this is a great discussion. Thank Natalie, because that was terrific. Grab a cookie and continue talking. And you're gonna be here for three weeks?
Yes.
3 weeks, 3 weeks she'll be here, so
Yeah.
let's continue, yeah.
The public
Yeah, I mean.